about, Nate, it sounds like you're rolling out some sort of individual financial planning kind of for the masses kind of software.
Yeah, we have a personal financial services team. And obviously our bread and butter is our employer financial services team, which the core focus of which is retirement plans. And so we've just been given a lot of thought to how do we continue to create synergy between those two
Hmm.
teams, and our target market are those executives at the companies we're already working with on the retirement plan side. So we have we're in a unique position to be able to market our financial planning services. And to Kyle's point, we're getting more and more demand to provide financial planning to employees anyway. So sort of this
Hmm.
unique opportunity to basically have our retirement plan clients pay us to do financial planning to our exact target market. And then obviously that ideally is going to lead to, some opportunities for our wealth management team down the road over and above just the financial planning piece, but also making sure we're profitable in the financial planning. So that's kind of like step one of what we're rolling out in 2025. And we just partnered with Right Capital to do that as
Okay.
opposed to e-money, but very similar from what I understand. And then I think like version two, which we're probably pretty far behind IntelliSense, would be to try to do something like that sort of downstream and really target that mass affluent demographic, and just as an additional value add to our EFS deliverable. So those are kind of the two big initiatives we're working on. I mean, the margins are obviously significantly bigger on the personal side, so it's going to be really hard to continue to be particularly profitable just doing retirement plans. You either need to
Yeah.
expand your services at the employer level via like PNC employee benefits, or expand it at the employee level via financial planning, rollovers, and whatnot. I think IntelliSense has done a good job of kind of doing both, from what I can tell. We're kind of going to focus more on that wealth side. I'd love to get into like the employee benefits piece down the road, because I think there's a really nice fiduciary perspective that a retirement plan advisor could bring that industry. But that's kind of our game plan, is try to get a lot more intentional around how we sort of target is a dirty word, but how do we basically convert some of those employer clients over to personal financial services clients.
Are you adding that as like an additional fee, or how are you structuring that, or kind of just like marketing it that this is how our fee is broken down and this is included with it?
Yeah, so I can, if it's helpful at all, I can pull up sort of the deck that I've roughed out for. But yes, the short answer is we are going to charge a one-time per employee implementation fee for actually like setting up the initial plan, and then an ongoing recurring fee. And we're going to include as part of that, an annual check-in, but also sort of on demand, with some sort of ceiling on the amount of hours that we'll spend, but basically on demand access to a advisor, CFP, whatever it is. And then we're setting it up so there's like a institutional discount for a corporate partnership. So for a company to roll this out to their executive employees, and then they can either pay for it on their executive's behalf. They can cost share. So maybe the company picks up the upfront fee and the employee pays the ongoing fee. And then finally, they could just basically have the employee pay it, but they're getting the preferred pricing because of the corporate partnership. So it's basically getting our companies to advertise and market our personal services to who we want to be marketing to anyways, but it's on a less solicitory basis. It's the company that's endorsing us, as opposed to
Yeah.
us just targeting those highest income employees.
So are you basically, you've mentioned that like kind of like the executives, are you truly like kind of just carving out executives where you're not really meeting with anybody else for this package, or?
Yeah, so this we're planning on just targeting the executives. So this will
Yeah.
be an additional benefit a company can provide their executives population specifically, and we'll let them define sort of who that is. But as of right now, we don't have the boots on the ground to try to roll this out across all
Yeah.
employees, nor do I think all employees would need this level of financial planning. And so we think for those less sophisticated people, we're going to push them to the record keeper. We're going to push them to Venrollment, and then we'll try to cover as much as we can through our retirement counselors, which is like our education specialists at our
Yeah.
firm. We just have two of them, and they do a lot of one-on-ones and a lot of group meetings, but it's nothing like true financial planning.
Yeah.
And
That's
here's
interesting.
something that I would say to Nate to keep in mind as you guys are looking at this as well, and this goes for all of you guys too. Keep in mind that even your lower level employees at some of your different clients, they do have insurance needs. And so I know insurance is kind of a dirty word too, where people think that, you know, you just sell these products and make commissions. But at the end of the day, what we've found, at least from some of our initial financial planning that we've done for employees, is a lot of these people are underinsured for what they need from a life insurance perspective. And so when you have that conversation with them about what their families need and what happens if you lose your job or what happens if you know, something happens, you know, a lot of times long-term disability, short-term disability, of course, the life insurance side of things. So keep in mind, there is money to be made on the rank and file employees, and not just your executives. So, you know, as you guys start evaluating what you can do to provide value to your clients, in addition to, you know, really developing those relationships for ongoing financial planning, those are certainly conversations and areas that you guys can look at too.
Yeah, that's good. That's interesting, Nate. I forget what the program is for like kind of like it's like a 1 or 2 page like kind of employee education, like kind of comprehensive like game plan to kind of help them out from an education standpoint. And we thought about doing that, but the manpower to kind of make all of those reports and kind of input all the data sounded so hard for us to obviously kind of green light something like that for employees that we could potentially not even meet with or anything like that. So carving out the executives and allowing the client to kind of define who is in that realm is smart. That's interesting for us to kind of think about trying to add that on. Are you doing like an annual fee of like 300-400 or 3-4 grand and then kind of like a maintenance fee, or what are you kind of thinking from a fee cost standpoint there?
Yeah, I'll just quickly share. This is a deck I put together in Canva. And to the extent any of you are creating deliverables or whatnot, I highly encourage you to use Canva. It makes even like a Neanderthal like me put together professional decks. So it's a pretty powerful tool. So we kind of start with, you know, why even offer a program like this? I like this slide. It really hammers home why we as a firm are uniquely positioned to deliver on a program like this, because we're already living at that intersection between employer and employee. And we've been priming our clients about why you should work with a fiduciary for 10, 20, 30 years. And so this is a really nice opportunity for us. Plus, it's a very low cost of sort of customer acquisition because we already have such a warm relationship with many of these decision makers. And then we put a plug in for our different services, our core values, our people, sort of what is the financial planning service they get. It's all kind of just buzzwords, right? The accumulation, the distribution phase, what comes as part of that, what our proven process looks like, what the client experience, what they'll get, yada, yada. This is, as of right now, tentative pricing. So it would be a $1,500 one-time fee per executive that engages in us. And then through Advice Pay, we can set up recurring revenue. We're sort of showing it as a monthly. We'd probably bill it either quarterly or annually. So $1,200 per year. What's included as part of that, including some of the on-demand advisory support. And then talked about the funding flexibility. It can either be employer paid, it can be a cost share, or it could just be employee paid and leverage the corporate discount. Some of the additional services, which to your point, Kyle, includes advanced insurance planning, which can be a really nice opportunity, but often that comes with a one-time revenue and a lifetime of service. And so we want to make sure we're picking our spots with who we're doing insurance planning for, and then some of our other EFS services. And then, that's it. So that's kind of how we're framing it. Again, we haven't rolled this out formally, although I have sort of teased it to a couple of our more larger retirement plan clients, and they've both been incredibly excited about exploring some sort of partnership.
That's what initially came to mind for me, is like, how do you roll it out to existing clients? Obviously, if you're talking to them and trying to meet with their employees, obviously that's part of the job. So like trying to address like, how is the fee structure going to be set up moving forward for the conversations that you were previously having? Probably not as in depth, obviously, as what your hope is to have them moving forward. But like, how do you address like kind of like drawing the line in the sand, or how do you approach like current clients with that?
Yeah, I think there's two pieces of advice. One is it should definitely be under separate and distinct service agreements, so they don't kind of muddy those waters or open the door for potential sort of discriminatory challenges. And then the second, I think, is just making very clear that your 401k advisory fee does allow you to provide education and advice to employees, but it's specific to the retirement plan. And the reality is, for these executives, the retirement plan is probably just one of 100 different financial pieces in their puzzle. And so helping them navigate their other employee benefits, helping them with their outside IRAs, their brokerage accounts, right? There's a lot of planning pieces outside just the retirement plan. Whereas for the sort of rank and file, the retirement plan is going to be basically the vast majority of their retirement picture. I know it's sort of oversimplifying, but that's how I would sort of tee it up.
Yeah.
To justify why you're charging additional fee for what could be a service they might have perceived they were already getting all along.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
apologize. I kind of hijacked the meeting, so I was just curious because I know IntelliSense has done a really good job in this space, and I've heard Grant speak a couple of times about this, but I know that was not the topic of today's meeting.
No,
Oh,
but actually, I think it does tie into it really nicely, Sam. And so one thing I can do here is I'm going to show you guys an example of one of the IntelliSteps foundational financial plans that we roll out to everybody, because this is something that when you're dealing with bigger plans, you guys obviously have to figure out how to show value other than funds, fees, and fiduciary, right? So when you're going to a lot of your bigger plans, this is something that if you can develop something similar to it, this is something that we roll out. We just, like I said, we pull basically a census file from the employer and a census file from the record keeper. And then what we do is we compile all the data and it spits out into a report like this. So you can talk about, your budget. You talk about your debt load, so that based on what their income is, this is what we think their maximum debt load should be. Emergency fund, okay? Protecting against unexpected death. So your income, insurance, again, bringing up those conversations if you want to get more in detail with any of the employees. This is all stuff that's just supposed to trigger ideas and questions from the employees on things that they should be thinking about. And then this is where they'll bring those conversations to you guys as an advisor. And on the retirement plan side, you guys can go through a lot of this stuff, but then if they want to engage you guys outside of the plan and do more financial planning sorts of things, that's where you can really get in the weeds and provide value from there. So again, it'll show you a snapshot of where they're at based on the full employer match. What are they doing for that? It'll show them roughly current account balances, where things look there. And then from there, we can get into the financial planning needs around tax planning, estate planning, education, things like that. All that's included here. So it's really kind of meant to show people, where are you at today? Where should you be roughly? And then this should spark those questions as far as what they should be thinking about and where they should roughly be. And then again, it brings us in as an opportunity to then have a conversation with them about that. So that's the foundational financial plan that we're giving out to all employees of companies, even if they've got 1,000 employees. We print them out, mail them to their home address, or we give them to the employer if they want to hand them out during reviews and things like that. And then that really brings in the conversation of that financial planning. So Sam, I'll turn it over to you to kind of talk about that. But this is something that you guys can do for a lot of your larger clients if you're trying to show value, especially on the financial wellness side.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. That's kind of where I was talking about a little bit from like the manpower standpoint. So you're essentially just pulling census data from the providers and you're able to upload it. So it's all automated for you on the back end of things.
Yeah, we've got it all built out. I don't want to say it's like a software, but it's a combination of like AI and the software that we have that we developed that basically spits out this entire report for us. So it's in a really nice format. And that's basically what we do, is we just compile the data, throw it through the program, and it spits all these out for us.
That's good. Well, good. So obviously, I mean, we had the discussion come through a second ago of kind of like what we wanted to target today's meeting for. It's kind of an interesting group today, obviously, mostly being RPAG folks, I think, except for Andrew. Andrew, you guys didn't end up greenlighting RPAG, right?
No, we did not.
Yeah. So we'll kind of like throw the ball out to what you guys are doing, maybe outside of RPAG and kind of the software that you have access to, but targeting kind of like those bigger prospects, those bigger clients. Obviously, we're not, most of us aren't kind of creating our bread and butter being those $50 million plans or anything like that. But from a facilitation standpoint of trying to stay relevant with those clients, and then how do you get the foot in the door? I know, Nate, you've got a couple kind of in that realm. So if you want to kind of just throw your 2 cents in right away, and then we can kind of just see where conversation goes.
Sure. Putting me on the spot. I actually have $100 million finals presentation this afternoon.
There you
Fingers
go.
crossed.
Cool.
That does not happen every day. That's just very, very convenient. I think it's, I don't know. I guess it's probably a little bit different for us because we are sort of a big fish in a very small pond up here in Maine, which definitely works to our advantage. So we don't come across the national aggregators nearly as much as probably likely you all. So it's a little bit easier for us to differentiate ourselves from like the generalists that we're more accustomed to bumping into. With respect to the sort of 50 million and above, I don't think their needs are necessarily all that much different, although the ways in which you support them are definitely different. They typically have a much more robust and qualified HR and benefits team, so you're not helping them put out fires. I would say where you can add more value is definitely on like this is going to be like, not groundbreaking, but on the consultative side. So helping them explore everything from plan design, really in-depth plan design, benchmarking, leveraging everything from those national plan sponsor benchmarking reports, but also for us up in Maine, we work with like 250 companies just in Maine. So we have our own custom like L&H index where we're able to benchmark them against the firms they're actually competing against to hire, which is not a law firm in California. It's a law firm right here down the street from them. Beyond that, I would say having a really robust like practice management process for how you're keeping track of what you're talking about and always staying fresh. And Sam, I think I shared with you for your upcoming sort of RFP, we have like a pretty detailed executive summary report, 5-6 pages, that includes everything from sort of the high level plan metrics that their committees care the most about. We list plan accomplishments to constantly be reminding them that yes, the plan's in good shape, but it's because we've done X, Y, and Z. So I think sometimes with those larger plans, especially when you have more committee turnover, people kind of forget all the work you've done up until then.
Yeah.
So you kind of have to subtly remind them that like, hey, things are running smooth because we did all this, not because like you guys just don't need us anymore. We have a meeting like matrix that feeds from our fiduciary checklist. So we sort of outline like what the DOL's best practices are with respect to reviewing fees and investments, but more than that, reviewing self-direct brokerage accounts, reviewing managed accounts, record keeper RFP, like all those other DOL best practices, QDIA, suitability, stable value analysis. And then that outlines our meeting matrix, which is our 4 like upcoming meetings, and make sure that we're helping to coordinate with other service providers for those as well. So I guess now I'm starting to kind of babble on, but I would say, it's understanding that they do have different needs. And if you're a service first organization, you have to think about how to provide a little bit more consulting horsepower upmarket. And then B, being really organized with respect to your agendas, your topics you're covering, and helping to coordinate and also lean on service providers. Like let's say a Fidelity, they have a ton of expertise in areas that a smaller firm just can't do in-house, right? Like we don't have ERISA counsel on staff. We don't have total non-qual, in the weeds experts. And so leveraging service providers where appropriate, and don't feel like you have to be all things to all people. Think of yourself more as like a conductor or like a head coach.
Yeah, that's kind of how we always phrase it to our clients, is just like, we'll be the quarterback for you, and we'll know we're not going to know every single answer, but we're going to know who to lean on in those situations. And I think that's good. I know you sent me over a couple things, which I appreciated on that. And I think the biggest thing for me takeaway wise was like kind of the intentionality of the planning of it, as to like kind of allow your clients to know what will be expected of you in the next year. So it's not kind of like you're showing up and talking about what large cap growth did or what the market did or anything like that. Like you're planning out. So what's like kind of like a 1 year kind of review from a quarterly standpoint. So you talked about like QDIA due diligence. You talked about like record keeper RFP. Are you doing that stuff annually? Are you doing that every couple of years, or what does that look like from a calendar year service model?
Yeah, I was going to pull up a visualization of it real quick. 'Cause we'll do it better justice
And Nate,
than
while
just
you're
talking
looking,
at you.
I'm curious to hear what drove this prospect to go through this process, and then what issues they may be having, and then what solutions you're providing, or if it is like a finals meeting where you're actually bringing in other providers like Fidelity, Empower, whatever, who are the finalists, and what solutions you're kind of putting to the table.
Yeah, so this one's interesting. So it's the largest law firm in Maine. They have like a Northern New England presence, and they don't have a 321 advisor. They don't have an advisor, period. Their committee has a couple employee benefits and ERISA attorneys. And so I think they thought that because they understand the industry and the compliance, they could do it themselves. And I, because I have no life, was spending a Saturday looking through 5500s. And I had basically run a search because I was starting to find more and more that, particularly in like the mid to large market between like 50 million and $1 billion, there's a lot of plans that are still in more expensive share classes than they would otherwise be eligible for, particularly Vanguard. So Vanguard has a threshold on their index funds of $5 million, where it switches from the Admiral share class to the institutional share class. Exact same underlying strategy, exact same everything. It's just a cheaper version. And we're not talking about, huge amounts of basis points. But from a fiduciary perspective, how could you possibly justify offering a more expensive version of the exact same fund when a cheaper version exists? And it's one of the few index funds that does have a cheaper share class nowadays. Most of them, because of omnibus accounting, you just qualify for the cheapest mutual fund version. You just have to keep an eye on CITs, but most of those are either leveraged through RPEG or the minimums are really high. So it's sort of a unique opportunity. And this was one that I found had a bunch of these more expensive Admiral share classes when they were eligible for institutional. So I fortunately knew one of the ERISA attorneys and just fired off a complete cold email saying, hey, just a heads up, you have funds in here that are more expensive than they should be. And he's obviously an ERISA attorney, so I think he immediately recognized the risk, and that caused them to be like, oh, shit, maybe we need an advisor. Maybe we're not the smartest people in the room when it comes to investments. And that was what kicked this all off. And so now we're obviously interviewing to hopefully be their advisor. And I'd like to think because we brought it to their attention, we'll have a little bit of goodwill there. But that was how this opportunity came up.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that. I think I saw something on LinkedIn where it was like the structure of the investments was not like kind of the institutional or the R6 share class. And they said that the product of why it wasn't that was because they had like a revenue credit kickback or whatever, that the record keeper doesn't accept the extra revenue and it's credited back. And technically that was cheaper than the R6 or institutional. Are any of you guys doing that, or what is that from a structure standpoint as a facilitation? That sounded super interesting for me because I had never heard of it.
I always hear that with John Hancock plans. They always use the most efficient share class, whatever that is. And it frustrates me because I don't like, it's not very transparent, right? I never know what the actual cost is. So they do have a report that you can run to figure out what the actual cost is, but just from looking at it, you wouldn't be able to exactly tell what the actual fee is to the employee.
Yeah, Fidelity is particularly bad about this, where they have a ton of mutual funds that are less expensive net of that credit than if you were to go to the zero revenue share class altogether. So what we have as a firm policy is, generally speaking, if an opportunity to keep the net expense, so net of the rev share, can be the same or less, we'll always move to the zero revenue transparent pricing. If it's cheaper in the current, we'll keep it, but we'll never move backwards. So there
Yeah.
are some advisors out there that'll go with like the 2% gross expense ratio, but net of like the 1.5% credit, it comes out less. We feel like there's too much of a communication challenge there at the participant level, because obviously that doesn't show up on a 404A5, right? It's
Yeah.
just showing what that gross expense is. So we'll always move ahead or stay the same if the net is less expensive. And I'll share, we created, this is like the most simple spreadsheet, but it's a good way to like easily demonstrate this. I know it's a little bit small. So this is actually just like an export from RPAG, but it's highlighting, all right, you have the gross expense ratio, you have the rev share, and if they're crediting you back, what is the true net expense ratio? And then we just compare that against the zero revenue share class, or in this case, they were eligible for RPAG's T. Rowe Price CIT, and then we just quantify what that savings is. And this is actually for the firm I'm presenting to later on today. So actually going through, and one of the funds that was eligible is this Vanguard 500 index, has 18 million. So they have been over the 5 million threshold for like a decade, paying an extra 0.5 basis point, which again ends up being $900. But from a fiduciary lens, like it doesn't matter whether it's $1 or $1 million. And then we quantify what that savings would be. So day one, we might charge whatever, 50, 60 grand on this. We're already paying for half our fee through these fee savings. So that quantifying that can be much more actionable as opposed to just like threatening them with their fiduciary risk.
Especially when there's no advisor.
Go ahead, Sam.
I was going to say, especially when there's no advisor, obviously, when you're talking about adding in a true fee, that's what's hard to obviously quantify. Obviously, providing value day one like this, that quantifies the fee to a certain extent. But we've always found that the hardest of being like, obviously, like we know that you need an advisor, and we've talked to plan sponsors that don't have an advisor that don't really process it. But like putting something like this into a dollar amount obviously puts it into perspective for them.
Hey, Nate, you mentioned the Fidelity example. That's an example, or that's a case I run into all the time. Got a plan that has mostly Fidelity funds, active. There's several Fidelity active funds. In some cases, they have the K6, which I think is the zero rev share. In one case or two cases, there's a different share class, maybe the K share class, which has 25 basis point rev share. And when you do the math, the net expense ratio for those is actually less when you take out the rev share. I guess, do you ever look at it though, or do you ever talk to the plan sponsor about the idea that they're offsetting Fidelity record keeping cost with those revenue sharing credits? And do you ever talk about the idea that like the participants in that fund are paying for a larger percentage of the record keeping than everyone else because of this revenue sharing credit? So doesn't it just make sense to get everybody to a zero rev share for that reason, so that you're not just handing, we use a dinner menu or a dinner bill analogy, like here's the bill, you ate the steak and I ate the salad, and yet we're paying the same or whatever. So we have a plan that's like 30% of the record keeping is being paid by this one fund's revenue sharing. And so I don't think it makes sense to put that on all those employees, essentially.
Yeah, so the concept you're talking about is like fee levelization, right? So everybody paying a fair share. And there's two ways you can get there. You can either switch to all zero revenue funds and just charge it as a line item, or if the record keeper has the capability, which most do nowadays, to actually credit that revenue sharing back to the participant at the participant level, you end up at the same place. And if that investment they're holding is technically less expensive with the credit than if you stripped out the credit, which is super frustrating that exists, but it's just what we inherited as an industry. It's from a fiduciary perspective, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. And the DOL, from what I can tell, has said there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. Mercer has a really nice piece talking about some of the DOL guidance on that concept. But you just have to have basically documented in the meeting minutes for why you went with one versus the other. I think to your point, if you justified it because it's more transparent, there's a lag between when this revenue sharing gets collected and credited back. I think that's a fiduciarily defensible position to hold. Or you could say, you know, we went with the credit back because these funds are cheaper when you do that. And to your point with Fidelity, what's super frustrating is some of their funds are cheaper in a K6 and some of their funds are cheaper in K with the credit back. And because some of their fees are tied to performance, those change over time. So sometimes like the contra fund is cheaper in the K6 than the K with the credit. Sometimes it's not. It's super frustrating.
So I mean, I think back to your original point was this is too confusing. And from a fiduciary standpoint, let's choose a lack of confusion as the a much more straightforward approach as our fund lineup methodology, and let's just not worry about this crazy concept of fee levelization.
Yeah, and then
I think that's a
every once in a
defensible
while
position.
you run into a fund that doesn't have a zero revenue share class, right? Like Parnassus, even their
Yeah.
institutional has like 10 or 15 bips built in. If they're like hell bent on offering a ESG strategy that divests from fossil fuels and you select Parnassus, then what do? Right? You have to credit it back. So it's definitely a very frustrating aspect to the work we do. It would be cleaner if every single share class was like American funds, right? Where it's like all neutral. So if you build in 25 bips of rev share, the fund is 25 bips more expensive, right? Like that makes sense. And if you want to be a broker and you want to build in commission for whatever reason, then by all means go for it. But some of these ones that where there's not parity with the rev share, it's super frustrating.
What are you guys doing from a prospecting standpoint? Obviously, you talked about Nate having a relationship in this scenario, but we see it all the time with looking at large plan filers that have A share funds or R3, R2 that are like 10, $15 million plans. I think that's getting to the realm where they recognize kind of the fiduciary liability, but a lot of times they don't to a certain extent. Do you guys have a couple pieces or anything that you do from a cold outreach or from a prospecting standpoint to try to get in front of those people? Because those are, for us, I mean, we see it all the time with all of those plans that are around in like the local area. Then you can tell right away that they're probably not being managed by a dedicated 401k advisor, probably a wealth manager or anything like that. So like kind of trying to drive that value. I didn't know if you guys had anything. I've tried to ask RPAG multiple times if they had a piece or something like that, but it just seems crazy to me when I'm pulling up a $25 million plan and they've just got A share funds just all over the place. Just like, how is this still like this?
I don't know that I have any tips in particular. More so what I found, at least with the larger plans, is generally the cold outreach and cold emails go a little bit further than some of your smaller plans where you've got like the CEO or owner that's wearing multiple hats and the 401k is the last thing I think about. Generally, I've had more success with cold outreach on some of the larger plans with, like Nate said, more sophisticated, more dedicated HR teams that'll more than likely take your meeting. I don't know that I have any particular tips right now that I could share that work well, other than just doing the research like Nate has and do the outreach.
Yeah.
And be relentless
I think-
about it, honestly.
And the more you can try to quantify things, I think the better, because fiduciary risk is just like this amorphous, intangible thing. And no matter how many times you get in front of somebody to talk to them about it, they'll never view it as real until they actually get sued. I've always jokingly said, like, I wish I could start like an ERISA litigation arm where we just like sue shitty plan sponsors that refuse to work with us. I don't think that would be allowed, but there's so many times where a plan sponsor's like, I hear what you're saying, but we're just going to stick with our shitty advisor who is letting us use more expensive funds, even though that's like the one thing we've hired them to do. So I would say the more you can quantify, like, here's the actual dollar savings that you're leaving on the table, or if they're having the advisor be paid out of plan assets, I will, and it's particularly egregious relative to the benchmark, I'll use like FI 360's fee benchmark report or Plan Fees Prism, and I'll just shoot it to them and be like, hey, you know, I don't have a dog in the fight, but just for what it's worth, your advisor's being paid out of plan assets. Here's how they stack up against the benchmark. If you think it might be worth doing like an advisor RFP, just to benchmark they're in a good spot, something like that. And then
Yeah.
I'll also offer, like, if you need an advisor RFP template, you know, I'll send it your way, and we'd obviously love to participate, something kind of like innocuous like that.
Yeah. That's interesting though, like kind of like the market as to like who's gonna react best to it, obviously. And we would talk about like if you're reaching out to like a $3 or $4 million plan, talking about that stuff, they're probably not even gonna really give you the time of day. So trying to get into that market, you can at least get an ear to hear from to at least provide your pitch or anything like that, especially from a public standpoint, being able to provide whether it's the benchmarking or the fee levelization or the access fees that are just from the current setup of the advisor just not doing his job. So that kind of played into a little bit. I know we kind of went on a little bit of a tangent. Nate, you were talking about kind of like your annual calendar review as to what you do for those, because that's kind of where we're getting into the point of having 25, $30 million plans are really big plans for us, and trying to obviously drive that value multiple times a year to not get redundant with our meetings. So what's kind of that kind of touch point that it looks like for you or anybody else to kind of stay relevant, I should say, with a client that you've had for 3 or 4 years that is relatively big in size, obviously, to kind of just make sure that you're not posing them to potentially go out to bid or look elsewhere or entertain the person that's cold calling them.
So for our larger plans, obviously we'll try and meet as a full committee at least twice a year. Generally what we found with like, especially your $100 million and plus plans, I mean, a lot of the CFOs don't want to be on those meetings. The C-suite just sees that as kind of a waste of their time. So usually we'll do 2 full committee meetings a year, but then we get on a monthly call with the record keeper, payroll provider, and the HR staff to really make sure that everything's operating the way it needs to, so we can still keep contact with the main plan administrators and be front and center and drive initiatives there, and then just share what we've talked about at these committee meetings. So that's kind of what we've done, and we've found success in that, because again, it keeps that regular cadence of interaction while not overwhelming the C-suite with, you know, the redundant information. Like you said, Sam, you can only talk about funds so much in the market and the election and all the fun stuff that's happening. So
Yeah.
that's where we try and structure those that way.
So are you reaching out to your like dedicated rep, obviously, on the plan and setting that up with them and the HR director, whoever it is that's touching the plan mostly?
Yep, exactly right. Yep.
Now, I'll maybe just add to that too, is to focus on like what we call more like plan leadership type topics. So you obviously have your kind of blocking and tackling fiduciary items, right? Where you're reviewing the investments, reviewing fees, providing benchmarking, you're doing the QDIA suitability, some of those things that are more like every 3 to 5 years, which if you sort of pace them out right, they tend to give you at least one kind of big fiduciary thing to tackle each year. But then over and above that, some of those kind of more plan leadership pieces. So doing like a true, you know, deep dive on like retirement readiness. And this is where, again, leveraging the record keeper up market, they tend to have a little bit better data and better reporting capabilities for those larger plans. So we'll do things like that. We'll look at, you know, things like ESG, student loan assistance programs, like some of these emergency savings accounts, some of these things that are like complementary services that record keepers can provide those larger clients. That typically doesn't make sense for the smaller ones. You know, we'll certainly spend a lot of time on Secure Act 2.0. Of late, you know, we're starting to turn back to lifetime income options. And again, for some of these larger plans, these record keepers have developed solutions for them in one way or another. So I feel like there is a lot of topics to cover. And again, I would encourage you to lean on the record keeper. I know for smaller plans, it's, you'll sometimes feel like you're battling with the record keeper, where you're trying to be all things to your clients. You don't want anybody else to compromise your value add. I would say up market, you start to become a little bit more synergistic with the record keeper. I mean, a healthy level of skepticism, especially for like the Fidelities of the world that think they can just do it all themselves. But knowing when and where to leverage their technology and resources. And then you are just helping to kind of provide the overlay and like the helping to draw conclusions from the data and the reporting that they're providing you.
Yeah, that's good. from a RFP standpoint, record keeper wise, are you doing it every couple years, every 3 to 5 is kind of like the standard, obviously, that everybody says? Are you guys doing it any more frequently? I guess like from the 10 to 25 space, that's where you can kind of see decent reductions, obviously, if you're going through an RFP, but I didn't know if it was anything different kind of when we're like targeting those 50 million, $100 million plans by looking elsewhere.
We're doing it every 3 to 5 years. We typically provide like the Prism fee benchmarking report at every meeting, which the downside to some of these upmarket is the peer group's like 7, because I know RPAG isn't quite as
Yeah.
big up there. And then we will do typically like an FDI fee benchmarking report every other year. One of the things that's really nice about that report is it'll benchmark the managed account service. It'll also benchmark the self-direct brokerage account fees. Both of those are technically fiduciary pieces because they're being paid out of plan assets. So that's kind of nice, sort of check the box there. And then we'll usually do a full-fledged record keeper RFP every 3 to 5 years. I'd say probably more of like an RFI unless there's some serious service issue, but gives us an opportunity to demonstrate our value. Usually we can chisel a couple bucks off the per head fee, and then usually the next year we'll increase our fee, eat up that savings. And then, but yeah, so that's typically how we structure it here. I'll just, this is like not the fanciest thing in the world, but this is an example of the fiduciary checklist I mentioned. And it helps us make sure we're staying on track with like what items are we going to review quarterly? What items will we review at least on an annual basis? And then what will we review at least every 3 to 5 years? And some of those more like nuanced pieces, right? Cybersecurity, advisor, we'll even recommend they put us out to bid every 3 to 5 years. And I feel like being out in front of that in a weird way actually earns a lot of trust with your clients to say, hey, listen, if we're being paid out of plan assets, we should be being put out to bid every 3 to 5 years too. So that can kind of help in a weird way avoid going out to bid unexpectedly because of something. And then this is an example of like a meeting matrix that we have put together for a client. So basically, what are we going to be responsible for at each of those quarterly meetings? What will the record keeper be responsible for? And what are some of the kind of other items that typically the committee would be responsible for, like approving the minutes and whatnot? And this is, I'm taking screenshots. It's a little bit prettier in the actual format, but this was to give an example for our presentation later on today, some of that kind of plan management that we provide. But yeah. And then this is an example of our plan design benchmarking report that I had mentioned earlier, where we'll provide it in a little bit more client-friendly format than, you know, that 120-page plan sponsor report. We'll boil it down to like the most important provisions in there, and we'll layer on some additional discussion points around Secure Act 2.0. And then we'll also usually add some of our proprietary benchmarking based off our book of business too. And then all these other things are all RPEG reports that you'll all be familiar with. In this particular case, they're using the T. Rowe Price Target Date series, which I think most advisors know is a particularly aggressive target date series. It's a law firm. Usually law firms are pretty good savers. So is it really appropriate to be using such an aggressive target date fund for there? So just like one little like sound bite where they're like, oh, I hadn't really thought about QDIE suitability. Oh, that's a good point. So just those little nuggets you can throw in along the way. And again, just leveraging some of the screenshots from the different RPEG reports to show that, you know, we have a really, really well-established process for how we're doing these things. We're not throwing a dart at the dartboard. And as you all know, that's what the DOL is looking for. And I did highlight the rev share to your point around fee levelization and determining whether they're crediting that back, and if not, you know, how they justify having, you know, half the participants subsidizing all the record keeping expenses.
Mhm.
Nate, that's dope. I actually really like that report and everything you do. How often are you putting that together, and what do you feel like the time commitment is per client to throw that together?
Yeah, it's something we're only doing with our clients that we meet with quarterly, which is typically reserved for plans like, I would say 50 million and above. I don't put it together, so one of our analysts does. I don't think it takes them a ton of time. It's all information we're already reporting on. They mostly pull it from our past meeting minutes, and then usually I'll work with the analyst just to map out like the upcoming agenda items. But most of it kind of just feeds into itself with that fiduciary checklist and whatnot.
Yeah, it's basic, but that's pretty powerful. It's a good tool.
Yeah, I like the plan provisions. I think that's one thing that we like kind of itemize out of like kind of just tracking like what eligibility is and all of the standard stuff. But to put it right next to it as to like where the market's at is helpful for them versus like them asking the question or thinking about asking the question. If you're transparent with it on the front end, then it opens up more conversation with it versus like kind of just trusting that they will ask the question, obviously, which most of the time doesn't happen. Also, the advisory RFP is really ballsy, but I like where your head's at with it. It kind of, I mean, to me, it makes sense, obviously, and for you to kind of put your neck out there and saying like, hey, we do our job and we're very comfortable and confident with who we are as advisors. So if you want to look elsewhere, you can, and it's recommended that you do that. So that was really interesting that you guys do that.
Yeah, we let me think. I don't think we've ever had a situation where we've recommended an RFP, they've actually done it, and we've been fired. So again, I think the goodwill you earn from doing it outweighs the risk or the fear that it's going to lead to losing a client. Now, again, you have to be consistently delivering value, which I've no doubt everybody on this call is. So if it was like some two-plan Tony, wirehouse, I probably would encourage them to do it. But again, these relationships are sticky for a reason, and I don't think it's something you should shy away from a fiduciary perspective. And again, the more they can basically view you as their sort of one and only trusted resource, and you're so trusted that you would even be willing to recommend that they put you out to bid because you know it's truly in their best interest, like that earns a ton of goodwill long term, and it helps not only retain the relationship but continue to justify your fees, which I know are always being chiseled on that. So I think it's worth it.
And from a word of mouth standpoint, obviously, of your credibility, if plan sponsors are talking or HR directors are talking, like they know that you're truly out there for your best interest, not just trying to take advantage of them or anything like that. Yeah, that's all good. Does anybody have anything